I'm back with another monthly reading recap from somebody who has reading fatigue, and so even though I love to read a lot, I don't read for pleasure as much as I would like to. I should have a snappier title for that. My name is Carson. I'm writing my doctoral dissertation on early modern English literature, and basically ever since I made reading into my full-time job through grad school, I have found it harder and harder to read for pleasure and to actually be motivated to read. I've been trying to read just 2 books per month and then talk about them on here. My reading fatigue also extended to making YouTube videos fatigue though, and so this video is going to be not just what I read last month in February, but also what I read the month before in January. I don't give ratings, I just find it frustrating to try to quantify my enjoyment of a book in numbers, especially because sometimes I really enjoy a book that I actually don't think the quality is all that high for, so I never know whether to rate my enjoyment or my critical, I don't know, judgment. I just want to read more and talk about what I've read with people and get feedback from you on what kind of books you think I should read or what your reading experiences are like, or if you've read any of the books that I talk about here and then you talk about them with me. I just want to talk about books. So like I said, I've been trying to read just 2 books per month outside of the reading I do for work. And in January, I hit that goal exactly. I read just 2 books. In February was a bit of an outlier. I went on a romance novel reading binge and I read 15 books. So let's start with the 2 books I read in January. I mostly read ebooks, so I don't usually have books to actually hold up for this part, but this time I do. I read these 2 novels in the month of January. The first book I read was this one, Tastes Like War by Grace M. Cho, and this was recommended to me by a friend because she knows how much I love reading books that are in any way about food, and this book is about food in a really singular way. This book is a memoir, and the author, Grace Cho, grew up in a small Midwestern town. Her father was a white American and her mother was a Korean woman. They met in Korea and then moved to the US. Like I said, the book is a memoir. It's almost in equal parts kind of a biography of Grace Cho's mother, because this memoir is really reflecting back on her grief following the recent death of her mother and thinking back across her memories of her mother's life and kind of the missing pieces that got filled in through conversations and through learning more as her mother grew older, and especially as her mother grew older and had to deal with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And food is kind of the through line that Grace Cho uses to highlight moments in her own childhood and stories that her mother told her about her mother's childhood. It explores the way that your culture shapes your relationship with food, your childhood, the way that food and trauma can often be linked through experiences of war and scarcity and living in diaspora. Once Grace's mother was diagnosed with schizophrenia, she stopped having the same relationship with food and often later in life struggled to eat at all. And so it is telling a story about how Grace also learned how to cook the foods that her mother grew up eating, and how learning to cook later in life as a way for caring for her mother allowed her to experience her mother's identity more deeply and connect with her own history more deeply. It's a heavy one. It's very sad because of course throughout reading it the whole time that this central figure in the book, her mother, has passed away, and so there is this shadow of grief over the entire thing, but it is also really lovely, really interesting and thoughtful. I'm really glad I read it, but usually I can race through a book in 1 or 2 days when I sit down to read, and this one took me a while. This one I had to kind of sit with and work through more slowly. It's not a light and breezy read. I am, though, very glad that I read it. The perspective it had on food is really, really interesting, new to me, really lovely. The second book I read in January is this one, Salt and Broom. And this is the point also at which I want to ask you, if you're watching this, to give me recommendations for things to read in the comments, because this book actually was recommended to me in the comment section of one of my YouTube videos in which I was talking about my very deep love for Jane Eyre. because this is a retelling of Jane Eyre. It's really a reimagining of Jane Eyre, almost like a fan fiction alternative universe kind of version of the story, in which Jane Eyre is an herbalist witch who has been hired by Mr. Rochester to investigate what seems to be a haunting taking place in Thornfield. Also in this version, Jane is 30 instead of 18, which I appreciated. It just, if you're gonna retell the story anyway, why not just remove the weird age gap dynamic from that relationship? I really enjoyed reading this book partly as a way to think through the original Jane Eyre in this new way, because there were a few things that this adaptation foregrounded that are there a little bit in the original, and kind of thinking about these two texts in comparison to each other was really fun. One of those things is just the fact that this retelling makes Jane into a witch and centers magic, because in the original Bronte novel, there is this kind of undercurrent of, if not magic, then mysticism or, something otherworldly. I'm talking about things like Mr. Rochester making all these jokes about how Jane must be an elf or a changeling spirit, or the kind of magic or spiritual power that allows them to hear each other's voices on the wind when they're very far apart from each other later in the book. And then, like I said, in this retelling, Jane's magic is very based on plants and the natural world, and that's another thing that I really loved thinking about as kind of an exaggeration of what's already in the original novel, because the natural world is so incredibly present in Jane Eyre. There's all these talks in the original novel of, birds, there's so many birds, and rainstorms, and the tree being struck by lightning, and just, the moors. And so, being a huge fan of Jane Eyre, I just really loved that this gave me a bit of a new perspective on a new way to think about what is already there in the text I love. But honestly, just on its own, it was also a really fun read. I think probably even if you haven't read Jane Eyre, or if you've read it and hated it, you might like this one more. It's an extremely cozy book. Jane spends her time in this little cottage that's full of dried herbs, and she goes walking in the gardens at dawn, and there's a little cat who's there who follows her around and is important for the plot. And there is this mystery also at the heart of the story of this possible haunting of Thornfield Hall. And I'm not going to give any spoilers away about it, but I will say that it was a good little mystery. It was fun to read. Yeah, I had a great time reading it. So that was January, very relaxing, 2 novels as I hoped. And then there was February. In the month of February, I just went on a total binge. I read in the first week of February, it might have been more, 8 or 9 days. I read an 11 novel romance novel series set in Regency, England. And towards the end of the month, I read through another shorter series, 3-book contemporary romance novel series. And then there was also one true crime outlier book thrown in there for fun. So let's start with the 11 novels I read towards the beginning of the month. I did not enjoy all of these equally. Some of them fell a little bit flat for me, but overall the series was well written enough, engaging enough that I did enjoy the overall experience of just binge reading this. The kind of overarching premise that loosely ties all 11 of these novels together is that there's this quaint little town in 1800s England that has 2 powerful families living within the town who have been feuding with each other for centuries, the Redmonds and the Everseas. And so every one of the books in this series is going to focus on one of the siblings from one of these families. You're gonna have a Eversea brother, a Redmond sister, whatever. It's gonna go through each one of their love stories, and there will be an undercurrent of the family feud throughout it. And the first book of the series introduces the idea that the oldest brother of the Redmond family has disappeared years ago after allegedly having his heart broken by the oldest sister of the Eversea families. And that mystery of the disappearance and the relationship between these 2 people from feuding families is going to kind of crop up in each one of the books. You're going to get a little bit more information here and there. And then in the final 11th novel, it's the love story between those two people reuniting. And that was a good narrative thread. Often in a romance series, the books will just be loosely tied together by a shared cast of characters or a shared location. And so I did like the fact that there was not just a shared group of people across all these books, but a narrative that you knew was going to unravel slowly and then get revealed at the end. They do all work as standalone books though. I even read some of them out of order, so it's not like you have to read them in order to understand what's happening in the last one. It's just if you are reading them in order, you get little breadcrumbs here and there. I will say that the final book in the series was one of my least favorites. I feel like it didn't really fulfill the buildup that was built up over the course of all those other books, but I think that also it's a tall order to fill, to build up to something over so many books, and then it fell a little flat for me, but it wasn't bad. In general, I would say the author is a good writer. I think that she writes flirtation very well, which is always fun. I think that she's good at showing you the reasons that two characters should be together, other than just they're both hot and they're there, which I think a lot of romance novels I dislike tend to fall back on. These were more substantial. The things that I didn't like so much overall were just that some of the relationships were boring, and some of the characters I just didn't find as likable, so it wasn't as fun rooting for them. My favorite novel in the series was this one, It Happened One Midnight. This one was just, for one thing, fun to read. I had the most enjoyment of all of the books in the series. I also thought that the relationship was kind of the most substantially developed. It felt the most realistic, and I liked the main characters. They felt a little bit fresh. I read a lot of Regency romance novels, so sometimes it can feel like you're just reading the same story regurgitated over and over again. And this one was not that. And then in contrast to that, my least favorite in the series was this one, What I Did for a Duke. It wasn't bad exactly, but it was just, like I was just saying, it felt just like something I've read 100 times, and it fell back on a relationship trope that I personally find boring. She is a 20-year-old ingenue with this fresh, dewy-eyed perspective on life, and he is a nearly 40-year-old duke with a dark, twisted past, and everyone's afraid of him, but not her. The nearly 20-year age gap didn't bother me as much as it could have. I've definitely read romance novels where I don't like the story that the author is telling. I am uncomfortable with it. This wasn't one of those. It was fine. It was just unoriginal to me. But so much of romance novels are just personal preference, so this is just something that didn't work for me. I don't want to yuck anybody's yum. If you love reading romance novels between a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old, genuinely, there's no harm in that. It's a story. You might like this one. I didn't. Overall though, again, these 11 books were engaging, they were well written. If you are looking for a Regency romance series to dive into, I can recommend this one. I don't have any objections to any of them, some of them fell flat for me, but you can read them and make up your own mind. The other romance novel series I read this past month were these 3 books by Mimi Grace, which were they were so fun. They had me like giggling and kicking my feet. They were just silly, fun, flirty. I loved them. The premises are like absurdly whimsical and adorable. She's an eccentric city girl who loves crystals and dresses in bright colors, but she's suddenly inherited a wildlife tourism business, and so she goes to see if she can figure out how to run the business, and she meets the archery instructor who's kind of grumpy. She is a baker and she owns her own bakery, but her ex-boyfriend is about to marry her cousin, and so she needs a date to the wedding, so she asks the handsome owner of the boxing gym next door to be her fake boyfriend. A woman joins a matchmaking service to try to find her soulmate, and at the same time, her brother's best friend starts crashing on her couch. Yeah, that one just is pretty simple, but it works. These novels, as far as I could tell, were self-published, and a lot of the times with self-published romance novels, I get pulled out of the reading experience by little grammar errors or continuity errors and things like that. And either Mimi Grace is the best self-editor I've ever read, or I think more likely she hired somebody to edit the books for her because there was nothing disruptive in the writing to pull me out of it other than two little things across all three books. Once there was a sentence that was grammatically incorrect, once there was a weird jump cut and a perspective shift that didn't really make sense to me. But these were really well written, and they were silly and fun and flirty, and I had a great time. So those were the 14 romance novels that I read in the month of February. And then for a fun little palate cleanser, I read this book. It's about true crime, but more specifically, it's about women's obsessions with true crime and kind of probing into the ways that women sometimes fetishize, sometimes obsess, and just generally feel this hard to explain emotional connection to horrible stories of murder. I'm going to read actually from a section in this book where the author, Rachel Monroe, kind of differentiates her project in this book from what people expected of it. She says, "When I told people I was writing a book about women, crime, and obsession, this was always what they thought I meant. Serial killer groupies, prison weddings, Manson pen pals. It got on my nerves. As I saw it, these women were just playing out the most reductive and depressing tropes of heterosexuality. In a world where masculinity meant power and power meant violence, some women would always opt to align themselves with that violence and exert their own perverse power through love. It was a story as old as Beauty and the Beast. Being the exception, the woman that a violent man doesn't kill was a way to feel special and chosen, but it was an ugly kind of special tainted with other people's pain." I think that kind of gives you a taste of the angle Monroe takes in this novel, which is to really take seriously the deep feelings that so many women have about true crime, but also to problematize that and to question why that connection exists and to what degree things have been kind of exaggerated and turned into pop entertainment in a way that is sometimes harmful. I had my own brief but intense fixation on true crime in 2019. I was listening to My Favorite Murder, I was watching serial killer documentaries, and it got unhealthy for me. I was having nightmares, I was getting paranoid. I had to ultimately stop consuming true crime content because it was making me, I think, anxious about real things to a degree that was not rooted in reality. And so this book was really satisfying for me to read through because it is kind of trying to figure out why so many people like myself have that urge to consume content about this and where that comes from and what it leads people to do. If this had just been a book kind of retelling stories of famous murders, I would not have been interested in reading it. I don't think it would have been good for me to read it, but it was really not that at all. It was incredibly nuanced and humanizing, and I think that Monroe did a really good job of dealing with the sensationalization and sometimes fetishization almost of true crime without actually doing those things herself, without turning it into just shock factor entertainment or anything like that. It was definitely, entertaining and compelling to read, but in a very balanced and kind of analytical way. So that was what I've been reading the past 2 months. Another significant thing that I read this past 2 months was my own entire first draft of my dissertation, which was humbling. But I'll save that for a separate video about my dissertation progress. I also spent a lot of time reading the CMS guide on footnotes. Thrilling stuff. My goal for March will once again be to read 2 novels. Maybe it will be a January style month where I will only read those 2 novels. Who knows, maybe it'll be just like February where I'll go off the rails and read a bunch. In the description below of this video, I have the link to my affiliate page on bookshop.org, which if you go there, you can see my 2024 reading list of the books that are already on my list of things to read. And yeah, please give me any recommendations. I take recommendations from the comments and I buy those books and I read them. Thanks for watching and happy reading.